Ave omnibus, cui spectacula Metatron sequentur. Ego Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus sum. Hannibal ad portas.
The situation for Rome was dismal. We have 8 years. 8 years have passed, and Hannibal's grip on Italy is as strong as ever. However, he doesn't have enough troops and forces to conquer Rome. So everything is blocked. How can you unlock this situation? How can you get rid of such a menace? Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus. He was a survivor from the Battle of Cannae, where thousands of Romans had lost their lives trying to protect their homeland, Italy, outsmarted by the genius or strategic genius of their opponent, Hannibal. But he himself, Scipio, was indeed a genius, equal to Hannibal himself. And he saw as the key for finishing the war and ending the Second Punic War, Spain. He understood that Spain was the key, was the only way by which the Romans could have gained again control and power over Hannibal. At the time, the situation in Spain for the Romans was really critical. The Romans were losing territories and they were driven back to the northeastern part of Spain. So Scipio moves a whole legion and commands a whole legion, trying to bring reinforcements to the northern eastern region of Spain. His aim was New Carthage, the only Carthaginian city and base of operation which had a port fit for an actual fleet.
It had not occurred to the enemy that an attack might come against New Carthage. As a matter of fact, New Carthage was garrisoned only with 1,000 trained soldiers. Scipio had found out from fishermen that the lagoon on the north of New Carthage, although it looked quite dangerous, was shallow, so it was possible to ford. Waiting for the low tide, Scipio ordered a furious frontal assault against the gate of the city. Of course, the attack failed, but the Carthaginians, being ecstatic, were concentrated on the east wall. In the meantime, Scipio assembled 500 men with ladders on the shore opposite to the lagoon. Making sure the enemy troops were fixed defending the frontal wall, he sent his 500 men, who quickly ascended the lagoon wall. New Carthage was captured.
Scipio recognized that his real purpose and aim was not to be the armies of the Carthaginians, but it was to be their will to continue the war, their will to resist. And the only way to do that was to sieging and conquering their capital in Spain. By doing that, not only would it destroy and weaken the morale of the men, of his opponents, but also at the same time, he would make sure that the Spanish tribes would reconsider their loyalty.
So now the Carthaginians had lost their main city in Spain, and another boon to Scipio's forces was the fact that quite a few of the Iberian tribes came over to the Roman side. Now, this is probably what in 208 convinced Hasdrubal, meaning Hannibal's brother, to take the offensive. The offensive was not against New Carthage, because the Roman had garrisoned that very well, but it happened on a two-hill plateau. Now, the reason why Scipio decided to accept the challenge and face the Carthaginians on the battlefield was because Hasdrubal failed to unite with other Carthaginian forces. In this battle, we see that Scipio changes completely the Roman military tradition. We don't have just massed troops advancing directly on the enemy, but we have an army which was divided into 3 parts: light troops, called velites, which were in the center, and heavy troops on each wing. The velites were armed with javelins and dart and were used to scale the enemy troops which were located and deployed on the first plateau. Hasdrubal was then forced to order forward his main body. This focused the Carthaginians' attention on the front, and the Romans exploited this opportunity to struck their flanks with their heavy troops.
The Battle of Baecula was a very, very important situation that changed dramatically the situation, or at least the strategic situation at the time. Not only did Scipio remove completely the actual Carthaginian presence from Spain, and by doing so also made sure that no more Carthaginian troops could arrive from Carthage to help out and increase their power in the known world, in Roman province, but also he weakened Hasdrubal's forces, because considering that only 2/3 of his armies managed to remain alive, to survive from the battle, Hasdrubal had to change completely his plans. And please keep in mind that the plans of Hasdrubal's were to go to northern Italy and reinforce Hannibal's, and probably if the two brothers, Hannibal and Hasdrubal, could have joined forces, then Rome could have been sieged. Now Hasdrubal had to lose time, basically, in order to reinforce his troops with new recruits and Gauls who needed to be trained. And time was a critical thing to have in order to gain advantage over your enemies.
When eventually Hasdrubal arrived in Italy, which occurred in 207, we have to consider that more than half of his army, which was made of 50,000 men, consisted of unreliable Gauls. When a Roman army led by Consul Caius Claudius Nero faces them in northern Italy, they managed to surround and destroy completely the Carthaginian army. When Hasdrubal realized that all was lost, he charged deliberately a Roman cohort and died fighting. There is a legend about how Hannibal first received news about the disaster. The legend says that Romans catapulted Hasdrubal's head into Hannibal's camp. Whether this actually happened or not, as soon as Hannibal realized what had happened to his brother, he withdrew his army to Bruttium, which is modern-day Calabria, southern Italy, continuing to hold Romans at bay by losing all hope of sieging Rome. Now, the Carthaginian Senate was alarmed by Scipio's victories in Spain, and they sent 3 new generals to southern Spain: Hanno, Mago, who was one of Hannibal's brothers, and Hasdrubal Gisgo. What Scipio did to face this new threat was a very interesting and intelligent move. He used most of his armies to engage Hasdrubal Gisgo's army, or Carthaginian army, but in the meantime, he also sent a detachment of 10,000 infantry and 500 cavalry, led by Lieutenant Marcus Silanus, to secretly march against Hanno and Mago. They marched so quickly that the Carthaginians had no time to prepare for the battle. Mago had to flee, and Hanno was killed. Now, with this move, Scipio made sure that he could fight Gisgo without having to fear to be attacked at the rear by the other 2 Carthaginian generals. The new battle, where we have the actual confrontation between Hasdrubal Gisgo and Scipio Africanus, happens in 206. Now, the Carthaginian army was incredible: 70,000 foot, 4,000 horse, and 32 elephants. And we also have to consider that although Scipio had gathered 40,000 men himself, half of these were probably native levies. The kind of tactical operation that he decided to do was incredibly interesting. Now, we have to consider that what happened is that the 2 armies came face to face at Ilipa on the Baetis, so we're talking about a few miles north of present-day Seville. What's interesting about what happened is that none of the 2 armies could find something, an advantage, an opportunity to strike, so they did not do so, neither the Romans nor the Carthaginians. And near twilight, each day, the tired and weary armies would go back to their camps to rest. Now, as this was happening, Scipio was studying Gisgo's formation. Now, both the Romans and the Carthaginians were using the same kind of tactical formation. The Spanish levies in the center, while the Carthaginians were placing their elephants in front. Now, this happened for quite a few days, but what really is interesting is what happened on the last day.
It was now time to act. Scipio ordered his troops to be fed and ready before daylight, and sent his cavalry to attack the enemy outposts at dawn. By doing so, not only he caught the Carthaginians out of surprise and forced them to rush quickly to get ready for battle, but he achieved 2 very important things. First of all, they had to repeat the same exact order of positioning that they had been using every day, making sure that they could not alter it, even if they wanted to. And secondly, they had no time to be fed.
Taking advantage of the fact that the Carthaginians could not change their battle formation, Scipio surprised them, changing completely his battle formation. He put his Spanish recruits in the center and his Roman heavy infantry in the wings. He also knew that the Carthaginians could not change the battle formation, not only because they did not have time to do so as they were rushing, but also because a major shift without having prepared to do so would have meant being vulnerable to the enemy. He then waited and waited, letting the enemy starve. Around 1 p.m, Scipio ordered the attack. His heavy infantry wings started to destroy the African opposition. The Romans methodically destroyed the enemy wings, and the hungry and tired enemy had no choice but to retire. It was no longer a fight, it was a butchery. Victorious, Scipio returned to Rome with the intent of carrying the war to Africa.
The invasion of Africa by 30,000 Romans happened in the spring of 204. They reached a nearby location where the town of Utica was, and they planned on sieging the town in order to create a supply base for their forces. However, the arrival of 2 enemy armies could force the Romans to move back into a nearby isthmus and create a fortification. The 2 armies were led by Hasdrubal Gisgo and Syphax. Hasdrubal Gisgo had brought 30,000 infantry and 3,000 cavalry, whereas Syphax had brought with him 50,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. The situation for Scipio was very dangerous. So he decided to avoid open confrontation, and he fortified or created a fort in the nearby isthmus and began negotiations. What he offered, in exchange of the Carthaginians returning from Italy to Carthage, he would have gone back to Italy. But was that his real intention? Scipio's real intent was a sneak attack, but the only way to achieve that was to gain as much information as possible about the enemy forces' camps. And his emissaries for negotiation provided just that. Now he knew where the enemy camps were, how they were fortified, possible weaknesses, and the position of all the mountain sentinels. He knew where they were posted. He was getting ready to attack.
Scipio confounded the enemy, called him for an armistice. He had found out, thanks to his negotiations, that the enemy's camps, particularly Syphax, were made mostly of inflammable material, and some of the huts were on the outside. Scipio divided his force, waited for nightfall, and set both camps on fire. Not realizing that it was the Romans who set fire, the Numidians and the Carthaginians assumed that it was a natural fire and rushed out unarmed and fled in disorder. The Romans were waiting for them and cut them down, one by one. The result was a massacre. Probably 40,000 Carthaginians and Numidians were killed or died in the flames. In one stroke, both armies had disappeared. The Carthaginian Senate, frightened by Scipio's presence and not having any army to defend themselves, called Hannibal back to Africa. They agreed peace with the Romans, but broke negotiations immediately in the very moment Hannibal reached Africa, gaining confidence again. This is probably where Scipio's genius manifested itself the most. He knew that if Hannibal had reached Carthage and had used it as a fortification, then he would have had an advantage. But instead of doing what most generals would have done, which would have been to interpose his army between Carthage and Hannibal, he went south to the valleys. The Bagradas valleys, where most of the food supply for Carthage were taken from. Attacking the valley and starting to destroy their food supplies, Scipio forced the Carthaginian Senate to ask Hannibal to pursue Scipio. As Hannibal arrived, Scipio could choose the ground for his battle, and the Battle of Zama began. Scipio placed his heavy Roman legions in the center, his Italian cavalry on the left, and Manessa's Numidian horsemen allies on the right. Behind the reserve were Manessa's light infantry. Scipio heavy infantry was in the normal legion formation of 3 lines facing the enemy, each line being formed by a series of maniples, which could also translate as companies, of about 120 men. It did make some change, though, from ordinary Roman custom. He did not stagger the second line of maniples to form a checkerboard pattern to cover the interval between the maniples of the first line. He lined up all three lines of men as to leave open spaces between each set of maniples. The reason for this was to allow light skirmishers, the velites, in the front to move quickly to the rear after throwing their javelins and darts. And also he was hoping to direct the 80 elephants that Hannibal held in front through these corridors, avoiding impact. Hannibal deployed in his front line 11,000 heavy infantry. His second line was made of 11,000 Carthaginian and African levies, and some Macedonians. On the last line, he held his veterans. His wings were 4,000 cavalry. Now, we see again that at this point, Hannibal's army was superior to Scipio's. But as the battle opened and Hannibal ordered his elephants to charge the Roman line, Scipio used a very interesting strategic idea. He directed a blare from his trumpets and cornets, terrifying the elephants and causing some to turn tail and smash Hannibal's troops. Because of all the disorder that this move had generated, Hannibal's best horsemen were also thrown into disorder. And this is where Manissa had an opportunity to launch an attack, exposing Hannibal's left wing. Now, not all elephants were scared by the trumpets, and some actually managed to impact the Romans and cause some damage. But the lanes that Scipio had organized actually did work, managing to avoid the actual bulk of the elephants. The second Carthaginian line was very strong and started fighting against the Romans. But the Roman line was stronger and overlapped the Carthaginian, cutting them to pieces. This is when Scipio realized the danger and called his men back. The Carthaginian third line of veterans was fresh and ready to fight, and it would have probably overwhelmed the tired Romans. He therefore ordered the second line to come up into the intervals between the first line, thereby creating a long, solid line of ranks. The Romans now advanced on the veterans. We read from Polybius, the principal historian of the war. The contest was for long doubtful, the men falling where they stood out of determination, until Manissa and Laelius arrived providentially at the proper moment. The cavalry charged the Carthaginian rear, and it was the end of Hannibal's army. Carthage disappeared, and Rome gained complete power over the Mediterranean Sea. Hannibal, though being a survivor of the battle, committed suicide in 183.
Alright, I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please remember to thumb up and share if you want. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Valete.